I wanted to start with, first of all, just your background. You began in Microsoft 2008 as a developer and test engineer, working on pen testing for the security team. And so since then, you've held a number of other positions, and now you are, I hope I get this right, Vice President of Enterprise and Operating System Security.
Lots of words, yeah.
Yeah, so talk to me, like in reality.
Sure.
What is your day-to-day process? What are your priorities? And what is your mission?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I have two jobs. I only get one paycheck. The first is I build capabilities in the variety of operating systems that Microsoft has. Believe it or not, I work a bunch on Linux. So over 50% of the workloads in Azure are on Linux, and I don't have just one Linux distribution I'm responsible for. I have 4, of course, in true Microsoft fashion. So everything from Xbox to real-time operating systems to the various flavors of Windows from IoT, et cetera. So building those capabilities would be things like trusted execution environments, crypto, boot integrity, compiler changes, you name it, everything from silicon on up. And Windows being a operating system that works on a number of different CPU vendors, which is growing all the time, it extends out to working a lot with silicon vendors, specifying things we might need, from exploit protection to increasing boot security, things like memory tagging, which help with memory safety. I work a lot with the sort of community there. And not just silicon, but then there's OEM vendors who now need to go implement firmware for that. So if you like operating system security, which I love, it's sort of a kid in a candy store, every day there's something new. Then I have this breaker job, which is where I started, where I lead vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, reverse engineering, red teaming. So those two things are very symbiotic, right? Being able to build something and then have a team who can go and look at breaking it is pretty fundamental to the way I think modern security teams operate. And so I sort of have this duality going on, which is on one side I might be pushing a team to fix a security issue or to change stuff. On the other side, I'm sort of encouraging folks to build new fuzzers, static analysis techniques. We're actually spending a lot of time these days with formal methods, which is quite interesting. I didn't think I'd be here in 2024 saying formal methods is the way forward, but that seems to be something that's developing a lot. So playing a lot of those roles. And then, of course, spreadsheets, approving expense reports, that kind of really fascinating stuff
right.
happens a lot, yeah.
Right. Do you have in your mind the ideas, because first of all, Microsoft is going through some changes now, and we'll get into talking about those in a bit. But do you have in mind any kind of formal legacy that you hope to leave from your time at Microsoft?
I don't think
I'm
not that old yet, right?
No, I don't mean to imply that you're on the way out. But
I just want to do my part. I don't think I think of the legacy stuff. If people think I'm a straight shooter and did some good work, that's good enough for me. I think if anything, I just want to continue to work with super smart people, including many of those folks in this room, and keep learning. I did this before you could get a paycheck for security. Starting in kind of high school and on IRC and things like that. Yeah. So I was doing this job in a way before I was getting paid for it. So I continue to use that as motivation. So in terms of legacy, I just want to keep contributing.
Okay. So I do want to talk about the CrowdStrike kernel issue. Sure. So obviously the outage caused by a CrowdStrike update in July raised a lot of questions about kernel access in particular, or access to the Microsoft kernel, Windows kernel. And so we have a really diverse audience here of academics, not just security professionals, but academics, policy analysts, and journalists with varying levels of technical expertise. So I wanted to start with just sort of, if you can provide us with an explanation of why traditionally, historically, security products needed access to that kernel.
Yeah, it's been surprising. I've gotten asked more about Ring 0, Ring 3 architectures more in my life, in the last 3 weeks and in my entire life, from a surprising number of places. So one, that's really cool actually that people are taking interest. Back to the sort of the question at hand, which is in a monolithic kernel system, we'll take microkernels and nerdy stuff to the side. Being able to have a loadable kernel module has a whole bunch of benefits for a security product. One is you can load early. And that means if you're doing battle with malware, particularly at the same privilege level that has a kernel driver, you need to load early, and hopefully you can set up your defenses, whether those be detection, enforcement, callbacks, before the malware loads. So that kind of early boot access is sort of critical to establishing a secure baseline. There are certainly other techniques that I think even are better these days, things like attestation, but getting there early is one. The second thing I would say is just visibility across the entire operating system. If you're running in a user mode process and you want to collect data from across the system, your extensibility options may be slightly more limited than what you could get in kernel. Your ability to sort of arbitrarily listen on a signal, which is critical, I think, to the work that many of the analysts and practitioners in this room need in terms of getting data, right? We're always looking for new pieces of data that we can correlate or build detections on. So kernel is in some ways ideal for that. The next thing I would say is performance. This is where you get really nerdy. Being able to sort of implement, a standard app or user mode program when you're collecting lots of data will trigger what are called context switches, which is the operating system has a bit of overhead when it switches from running in this sort of app mode to kernel, and those context switches cost in terms of performance. So something that may take a few milliseconds to do in kernel could be a few seconds in user mode, and if you add that up cumulatively in aggregate, that's a lot of performance overhead. So we could be talking 10, 20% of the machine. So being able to do that, especially on things like network analysis where you've got maybe a 10 gigabit uplink, adding a few milliseconds of latency there is a big deal. And then finally, I think this is the big one in particular. I've talked to a lot of people across the industry, which is anti-tampering. So obviously, as security products, thanks to many of the folks in this room, get better and better, they become critical path for customers. And I think if there's one thing we learned in this whole incident, it's that really EDRs, EPP, whatever the flavor of the day you want to call them, they are critical infrastructure at this point. The same as DNS, the same as network services. People need this to bring things online. And so what attackers now have seen is, hey, these products are really critical path. I want to disable them. And so we've seen things like vulnerable kernel drivers, all sorts of different techniques come up for disabling EDR and EPP. Kernel provides really the fundamental capabilities. I'll call them almost the instruments for protecting yourself as a security product. So for example, once you're sitting in the kernel, again, booting early, you can say, I don't want to load any kernel driver that's known to be vulnerable. That's going to sort of shave down the options for actually tampering with that product significantly. You can do all sorts of different techniques that really lead you to having more resiliency to tampering in kernel. Certainly, I think there are other ways of doing this, and that's one of the things we've been talking about at the summit. But traditionally, those are kind of like the core methods for why you want to exist in the kernel.
Well, I mean, given all of those advantages, there has been some talk post the CrowdStrike outage of pushing Microsoft to stop allowing access to vendors to the kernel.
Yep.
And you wrote a blog post recently where you talked about, you guys have listened to the criticism, you're taking it seriously, and you are looking at some kind of alternatives for doing that. Yeah. So in the past, however, there's been some pushback against that because that would imply, I mean, Microsoft is no longer just a software vendor, it is a security company itself. And closing that access to the kernel for everyone except Microsoft, of course, gives Microsoft some kind of advantage over other products and potentially means that those third-party products will not operate as effectively as Microsoft's will.
Yeah.
So when you said that you are looking at changes, does that include let's say, completely closing off access to the kernel for third-party?
Right now, we're not talking about completely closing off. What we are doing is listening to customers and, frankly, people in the ecosystem said, can you create a user mode alternative that might enable more resiliency? If you look at operating systems like Linux today, you can choose to do what's called eBPF, which is you could build an EDR on that, which has some trade-offs, or you can load a kernel driver. There's optionality. And so what we're hearing from CISOs, customers, and actually other vendors is, can you create another API that would enable us to do more things, like I talked about anti-tamper, higher performance, better visibility from user mode. And the one thing I would say, that user mode gives you certainly is resiliency to crashing, so-called memory safety issues, which is one of the things we saw back in July. And so one of the reasons I think Windows has become successful, and Dr. Christina gave a great talk on mentioning as it grew, is there's a lot of extensibility. That's in the DNA. It's like, let's make this platform as extensible and flexible as possible. And so the way we're looking at it now is we will create another platform, an API in Windows, that will allow you to build, hopefully, what's comparative in terms of security with increasing reliability in user mode. And the way we're thinking about doing that is implementing canonical services directly in the kernel, using hopefully memory-safe languages and secure by design principles, and then exposing those to folks in user mode in the same way you would have on Mac OS and Linux. Now, the market and I think customers will push people in that direction in some cases where they want increased resiliency, and that's what we'll wait and see happens. But right now, I think creating another API there, given the demand and the incidents over the summer, makes a ton of sense.
What's the time frame then?
You know, here's the thing is, we've got to build it in a way that people want to use it. As a platform provider, you know, I don't work for Defender. Defender's being treated the same way as any other security provider. You know, we have to build an API that people want to use. And so what we're trying to do is learn from the feedback we heard on other platforms where maybe someone just came in and said, here it goes, and no one can use it for several years. We're trying to skip ahead, and one of the goals of this recent summit was to sit down with some very, very smart people who know even better than I what that interface should look like, what are the requirements, and build it for them. And so I think what that means is we're putting, you know, from leadership on down, the max number of resources that are required to go and implement this. But it's going to take some time working with the vendors to scratch something out, say, what do you think of this? Get the feedback. Great, it's looking like on paper we've got a design, now let me give you some code and sort of work through that. You know, I'm hopeful that will happen very quickly, but it's hard to put a time on it. And I think what's more important is that it works well and meets all of those requirements than how fast we get it out. But again, you know, I would say it's a top priority because it's it's our mutual customer's top priority right now to get resilience back. They're all being asked by the board, what are you going to do about this, making sure this doesn't happen? And so, you know, it's on us right now to go and execute.
Right. So you've mentioned the summit a couple of times. That seemed like a significant event. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, earlier this month, Microsoft met with vendors and with government officials from US and Europe to talk about the CrowdStrike issue. And what can happen going forward. Yeah. So, I mean, again, Microsoft is now a security vendor, not just a software vendor. I guess my question is, like, what was the thinking inside Microsoft that made this happen and made this possible now and not possible at another time? Because that level of collaboration is new. Microsoft has collaborated with security companies in terms of, investigations, analysis, and things like that. But in terms of sort of, you know, you've been a competitor of the security firms. And so in terms of sort of that collaboration of deep core issues is new. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, that's actually, I'm clarifying that. We've had at least twice yearly conferences for the Microsoft Virus Initiative, not the best name virus in 2024, but where we work with all these vendors on API needs, adding additional resiliency, anti-tamper, et cetera. So actually this is not new, it happens quite often. I think there's an intensity here, and the scope of things we're describing certainly are more on the summit. And certainly the folks from the policy world and government officials showing up is a little bit different. But actually, when I walk in that room, every single person is a familiar face. They're people I email and meet with on a regular basis. Yeah. So that wasn't particularly new. I think what is new is bringing this sort of availability and reliability scope in. Normally in those conferences, we would talk about, hey, can you get me this new piece of data? This particular ransomware is using this thing in early boot. Hey, Dave, can you work with the team to expose some information? That's all quite standard. Talking about things like secure deployment practices and how do we get this, you know, security solutions community to the same level as AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. Because if there's one thing that the incident taught us is that hospitals will go down if an EDR goes down. And so quickly we've sort of got to mature this industry, and there's some folks that are doing great, there's other folks that have a little bit of work to do to get to that. So a big part of the conference actually brought in this sort of secure deployment. I'll give you a good example. We had the head of Windows Update, who updates 1.6 billion devices every month, does a pretty decent job, of course, just talking about what techniques they use, what APIs do we use, what are our approaches for monitoring patch rollout, and how do we roll things back, what kind of automation. So that portion of the conference, I think, was new in a conversation we hadn't had previously.
So in terms of, like, what did you hope to achieve with the summit? Do you think that you came to some good resolution?
Yeah, I think the two outcomes for me were, one is, as an industry, we, again, need to mature to being sort of cloud critical. And one of the requirements that came out of that is to have a kernel driver, we're going to require you to have a secure deployment practice that's transparent to everyone. And I think what that'll do is create some positive and healthy competition on who can be the most reliable and available, right up aside who can be the best at detecting threats, which makes tons of sense. And to achieve that, we're trying to land on a set of shared principles, things like slow rollout of patches, not directly going to all your customers, making sure you have automated rollback, that you've got the right level of data to do that, that your first so-called ring of rollout is diverse, right? It has different languages, different geographies. All those things that I think the cloud has done really well for a long time and DNS providers have done well. I think EDR vendors need to do that. And then just creating transparency so customers can actually understand that. That was number one. Number two is we are going to go build this user mode API. We are heading in that direction. We're going to do it with some shared principles, though, which is we're going to build an API that everyone can use, wants to use, and tries to solve those key points. And we're going to do it in a collaborative manner. So the goal is not for Microsoft to just shove something on everyone. That would just be a failure. The goal is to figure out with all these people who are in deep competition, how do we find some sort of shared standard and ways of sharing information? What kinds of things can we collaborate on? It was actually pretty cool. We had some of the top architects of these kernel drivers systems sitting around a round table with the top kernel architects at Microsoft, just talking shop, trying to understand what things would work well and not. That was a pretty incredible moment, actually. I mean, these are folks who compete on a day-to-day basis, all from different companies, having a super transparent and collaborative conversation. I think two things out of that. One, it shows that industry can collaborate. And two, it shows that there are a ton of shared interests in how to evolve the platform. So I thought, for me, those were the big takeaways from the conference.
So last November, Microsoft launched its Secure Future initiative.
Yeah.
I guess I want to start with sort of what prompted it and how does it address the criticism that security has long taken a backseat to development at Microsoft?
Yeah, I think obviously there has been a few high-profile incidents that really caused, I would say, Microsoft to reshift focus on security.
What incidents could you be talking about?
Oh, you folks know better than I. And so I think just refocusing there. I've been at Microsoft long enough to have been through a few waves of this, including the SDL, and I know Kim, Katie, other folks there were side by side with us back at that time. And so the way I would describe it is, as the threats get more substantial, we need to evolve our culture, right? You can't just say, an early 2000s security culture and process is not appropriate for 2024. And so, as a lot of the world's data is centered on Microsoft infrastructure, the world's attackers have as well. And I think that's causing us to reevaluate and frankly up our game. And so what I can say personally in the SFI that's been awesome is, number one, I'm seeing leaders across the company put down security accountabilities in their year-end reviews in a way that maybe wasn't done previously. That's awesome to see. I transparently have security leaders coming to me and saying, can you take a look at our priorities based on your experience, really leaning in and saying, this is for real. Like, I'm going to be judged on this. My team's going to be judged on this. This is top. And seeing Satya and the team on down pushing that, I think, is a new theme. The second thing is just resources. Resources are pouring in. Folks are really cutting features to focus on security. That's the right thing to do, and that's a big change. In the past, we've done a lot of things in parallel, which are always challenging, right, to prioritize that. But I think at this point, I'm a bit of a kid in the candy store, which is the security stuff is being prioritized as top. So that's good to see.
It's more expensive, though. I mean, has Microsoft calculated that expense of what it will be in as our?
Well, I think our CFO would probably have a good list there. But here's what I can say. Remember, I have both a vulnerability analysis and a development team. I have cut lots of features in the operating system to focus on security fundamentals. Substantial numbers.
Oh, okay.
So there's a cost to that, obviously, and so it's very real.
Well, so that leads me to the question of, can you give me some concrete examples of where decision-making has been driven by the initiative and changes?
Yeah, so I can talk about things like in Windows. So for example, been talking about this for a while, but it's really happening. We're removing admin in Windows, which is going to cause some app compatibility issues, et cetera, trade-offs, right, that will impact the product, but it's the right thing to do for security. So starting in fall and by default, sometime next year, we're going to remove the ability for you to just run in admin all the time. Instead, you'll run in more of a Linux sort of sudo mode, and you'll elevate just in time for certain things. Yes. So that's a pretty radical change for an operating system that's gestalt is like, you can run the thing from 30 years ago, but it's the right thing to do.
Kind of overdue.
Yeah, in some ways, right? As a security person, I'll say yes, but there's good reasons for not doing that. We're also doing things like having mandatory code signing a reputation, so no more, generate a packer that evades everything on VirusTotal and send it out. there are some very substantial changes in the operating system that, again, would have been, I think, more of a balanced discussion previously, but with SFI, with the push from customers, and I think the push from the good work from folks in this room, are making really substantial changes.
Okay, great. I have just time for one more question. I'm not sure we're going to have time to go to audience, but Windows recall on your new AI PC brought some fears around AI and the indexing of computers. Microsoft withdrew the feature temporarily and promised some changes. What happened? You were talking last night that you guys did think this through thoroughly, but walk us through what happened and what the changes are going to be in.
Yeah, the first thing I'll say about recall is it's an interesting feature like many AI features, which is it's sort of pushing the boundaries of data collection, and there's obvious people who have concerns around that. And so I think what really happened is that we heard from customers like, we want to see more controls here, more data protection and more privacy. And I think being an insider preview, this is normally what we would do, right? We'd preview a feature, hear the feedback, and change it. And so we'll be launching it again, I think, next month with some really substantial changes in the architecture. I'm really proud of the changes, actually. I think they're pretty cutting edge, so it'd be great to talk about that more. But I think what we're really in is, in my opinion, is in a learning mode with some of these AI features. You know, it's not just Microsoft doing this. You've got like Google's push on the new Pixel. Apple's got their Apple Intelligence stuff, which is great to hear them talking about security front and center. But we're really in a new modality, which is we're doing on-device processing with these MPUs, which normally would have been data center style things that are now happening on the client. So there's a whole bunch of different sort of threat models and things that have to happen there. We're collecting data like screenshots, right, which is super sensitive, and they're being stored on the device. And again, I believe the security controls are all in place, but we need to hear from how users want to control that, whether they want it on, optional, or by default, those types of things. So I think what really happened here is we heard from customers that they want to see changes. In many cases, I think when folks touch the feature, they'll be actually pretty excited about the functionality, but the concerns are real, and we heard them and made changes.
We do have a couple of minutes. Do you want to go into some additional changes that you're making?
No, I think when the feature comes out, it'd be great for people to kick the tires. I'd rather not just say, hey, go and look at it. It'll be out there in just a couple of weeks, and then I think I'll have a lot more questions then.
Okay. Do we want to take some questions from the audience, Ryan? Where I am? Is Ryan gone? Did he abandon?
Much time?
Oh, there he is.
We have perhaps time for 2 quick questions.
2 minutes, yeah.
Anyone?
Katie.
She's going to ask when Clippy's relaunching.
No, thanks for giving this talk. Question, so Microsoft is one of a handful of vendors that has had to basically hold back, the hordes that are trying to exploit computers for decades, right? And you're in this position, because of your market success and ubiquity, but the governments around the world have been struggling to try and build their capabilities and add to the layers of protection for critical infrastructure and beyond. So the question is, as governments are trying to build up their capabilities, what do you, as this important player in the industry, need from them most strategically to help you? Essentially, you've been running your own Iron Dome forever. What do you need from governments?
I think better dialogue on core requirements. So as the person who implements a lot of these features like in the cloud, et cetera, I don't think there's enough dialogue between the community like this, the threat intelligence community, who's able to do very detailed analysis, like in the APT1 report, where we're understanding how the techniques are changing in a way that the operating system and engineering kind of folk can change fast enough. So for example, it's often many months removed from when someone detects a threat, does a full reverse engineering and analysis, puts out a few techniques in tradecraft until we can then put that in the engineering pipeline. I think learning to shorten that cycle in the same way we've done it for detection into engineering is key. We don't have great languages for doing that. So for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework as it stands today is great for translating stuff into detection engineering. It's not great at translating into operating system and code engineering. And so I think efforts like that, just finding more of a common language or Rosetta Stone for converting TI into concrete changes in infrastructure is key. One of the things I do on the side is I work with CISA on Jeff Moss's technical advisory committee. We've talked a lot about how do we translate some of the things we're seeing in the threat intel sphere into more concrete engineering faster. I just don't think we have a great method for that. So that's something I'd like to work more on.
So unfortunately, I think we're, oh wait, Ryan, do you want to take one more question? Okay, so, sorry. Anyways, David's available.
I'm around. Anytime.
Anyways, join me in thanking.
Awesome. Thank you.